Welcome to Beyond the FAR from GW Law's Government Procurement Law program, where experts unpack the business of government. From Washington and beyond, we explore procurement at the intersection of law, policy, and practice, shaping markets, driving innovation, and impacting lives across the globe. And now, here's your host, Dean Jessica Tillipman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Beyond the FAR, the GW Law Government Procurement Law Program's new podcast. I'm Jessica Tillipman, the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law at GW Law, and your host. I'm excited to kick off this new way of connecting with our global government procurement community, where I will speak with experts, leaders, and just the really interesting people who are shaping the future of government acquisition and policy. I'm thrilled to welcome our inaugural guest, Professor Albert Sanchez-Graells. Albert is a professor of economic law at the University of Bristol Law School in the UK. He's a leading scholar in public procurement law, and over the past several years, he's focused his scholarship on the digital transformation of procurement. In fact, Albert's 2024 monograph, Digital Technologies in Public Procurement, Gatekeeping and Experimentation in Digital Public Governance, explores exactly how governments are using and struggling to regulate AI and other emerging tech in their contract processes. Albert has also authors a delightful and interesting blog, howtocrackanut.com, so you should check that out too. All right, last year we co-chaired the AI stream at Nottingham's Global Revolution Conference together, where we agreed on quite a few points and disagreed on a few others. So I'm especially excited to continue that conversation today. Okay, so on today's episode, we'll be discussing all things AI and government procurement law, as well as some things related to kind of the acquisition community and workforce capacity issues. But we'll explore three big themes as it relates to AI: the role of government procurement in government's acquisition of AI, the challenge of regulating AI's use by public agencies, and how AI itself can transform the way procurement is done. We'll also compare what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic, how the US and the EU are taking different approaches to responsible AI procurement. Okay, that's a lot. Let's get started. Albert, welcome.
Thank you, Jessica. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here, the first one. Let's see how this evolves. You know, it can only go higher from here.
Right. Or at least, hopefully they don't shut us down after this first one, really low bar. But I have to say, before we jump into the AI stuff, there was part of a real purpose for me asking you, and that's because you and I were sitting at, Nottingham's Global Revolution Conference, and we were sitting across each other at this dinner, and I turned to you and I said, so I think I want to do this thing where I talk to people and I record it and then I put it on the internet, but it's not going to be a podcast. And what did you say?
I said, well, it's a podcast that's not a podcast.
It's a podcast that's not a podcast. It's definitely a podcast. So you were the first person I told, and you didn't laugh me out of the room. And so truly, I'm excited to have you here and excited for this new way for us to communicate. And I anticipate that you will be back again if we don't get shut down after this episode. Okay, so let's turn here, and we've introduced you, and let's talk a little bit about your work and your research. I want to know, at least at the outset, or maybe even take a step back further, and just tell me a little bit about how you even got into teaching public procurement law.
Yeah, so it was by accident. I started off as a competition lawyer, so an antitrust lawyer for your American audience. And all of a sudden I realized, there's these very strange, very regulated markets where competition doesn't seem to always quite work. And that's how I got into procurement, and it was an unexplored field. So I wrote my PhD on that. And then I realized it's a very crowded field for antitrust lawyers. Procurement is a bit of a more open discipline, especially in Spain, where I come from. So I started focusing on procurement, then moved to the UK and kept looking at it. And slowly, when you realize that the traditional procurement scholarship is not seen as particularly highbrow or theoretical or complicated, it's seen as something practitioners do. So I started to try to find other areas of sort of more excitement for academic minds. And I started looking at the technologies. And this was back in 2017-18 when we were thinking, we're going to put procurement on a blockchain, and then we get rid of corruption, we get rid of everything else because it's going to be sort of fully automated, self-executing. And I thought, well, it's too good to be true, so surely it's not going to happen. And before I could write it's not going to happen, we had moved on. And the next thing was AI. And again, there's all these claims that, we'll talk about later about how AI is going to make things so much easier, no friction, no corruption, fully traceable, massive improvements in innovations. And I thought, it's too good to be true. And this time I got to write the book that says it's a little bit too good to be true. And I think you need to make very significant investments and you need to put lots of checks and balances if this is not to go completely off the rail. So I think that's probably how we got here. And I have really enjoyed your points of view, and I'm sure we'll bring them later about what these things mean for practice, because that's the other end of the spectrum. I came to this from quite a theoretical point of view, but I think sometimes we agree because, once the rubber hits the road, the problems one imagines actually happen. So I think we have plenty to discuss.
Well, it sounds familiar. I feel like most people kind of fall into the public procurement space. So I'm actually not surprised to hear that. Mine was a bit earlier in my career, but I actually started on the practice side in government procurement and white collar and then kind of transitioned. But I feel like, absent people, at least in the United States, coming from the military or having like a military background or somebody that worked in government contracts, people all just tend to fall into it. So
Yeah.
let me transition a little bit. Let's talk about AI. And, for a while, I was grouping it with this bigger category of emerging tech because we really did see, and to date, there's still a good number of things that some people actually think are AI but are not AI. But really now AI, as it's advanced so rapidly, at least in the past year or two, is kind of dominating everything. And I have to ask, when did you realize, because you've been writing about it a bit longer, when did you realize this was going to be a big thing in procurement?
Well, I think if you take a step back and forget for a moment about ChatGPT, so let's go back to before ChatGPT was launched. AI was basically data and trying to do things with data. And I think that worked better with other emerging technologies, which was mainly about sort of complicated software, if you want, or things like this. And what I thought about is procurement is very data heavy. So there's tons of data about procurement, but also any official that has to award a contract has to go through tons of documents. So it looked like the sort of information heavy activity that you could think like lawyers doing discovery were trying to figure out and in other places. So I thought because procurement is so data intensive, AI in the traditional sense of classifying stuff or creating some sorts of automation would be important. But what I could not imagine, and I think it caught almost everybody by surprise, is what this generative AI is doing. And to me, they are two completely different discussions. And I am quite negative in my views about how generative AI is affecting everything. And I think it's because it's mainly misunderstood and misused, and we can get to that later. But the other sort of beef I have with the generative AI wave is that we only talk about that sort of AI. We seem to have forgotten completely about the good old-fashioned, let's try to get these data silos interconnected so we can extract some information from the data that we have and do things that are actually based on ground truth that we understand, can look at what the algorithm does, because we don't need particularly complicated things to process this sort of business intelligence that we could be doing. Now it's all about put a chatbot to it or shove a lot of information to a chatbot and ask it questions and hope that it's going to give you something that is factually accurate and useful. And I think that's part of the issue. I was lucky that I finished the book just before ChatGPT was launched. So all I had to do in the proofs is just add somewhere saying like, well, this probably also applies to Gen AI, but that was it. But it has completely changed the conversation from the governance perspective. Because one of the things that I think is quite clear with the traditional AI is that if you're not a data scientist or if you don't have a team of data scientists, it's beyond your reach. So you cannot break things because you don't know how they are made of. But the generative AI has put it in everyone's pocket. You have a smartphone, you have your ChatGPT or your Gemini, whatever other models you're using. And I think that from a governance perspective, that what really worries me, because it's a little bit of a uncontainable phenomenon. And even if you want to be a responsible organization, you want to adopt policies about permitted and not permitted use, just monitoring it is going to be very, very hard. And that's one. The other one is you and this happens to me, maybe this is just me being traumatized, but if you oppose the use of generative AI for absolutely everything, right now you sound backwards. And it sounds like you are trying, it's like, oh, you're opposing the printing press. It's not the same thing. And I think that's what we are maybe missing, that generative AI presents itself as doing things that it's not what it's doing. And in this case, if you misunderstand it, you can actually break lots of things. And that's what worries me in procurement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you raise all those points because I have to say, if you are a zero on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of your view towards Gen AI, I'm probably a 6 or a 7, probably a 7, because I love it. I actually have conversations with ChatGPT, and I found them fascinating. And I'm like convinced I'm going to turn you on this. But especially, I was talking to my faculty at JW Law last week, and my colleagues and I, a few of us, were providing a presentation on how do you use AI as a law professor. And I said, it's not necessarily research, that's fine. But for me, it was when I have a component of my article, I will go to AI and I'll say, like, let's think of the counter arguments or what's the weakness in this. ChatGPT, by the way, is
Mm.
meanest critic I've ever met, but so unbelievably helpful. So I've actually really enjoyed it, so that as much as I enjoy my conversations with you or other colleagues about certain concepts, there's something about me getting ready for work and talking to something, and the time when we're all kind of walking through in our heads ideas for articles or things that we might do next. That's some of my best thinking, is getting well and getting ready for work. And being able to talk it out in real time where someone's kind of having a back and forth. And I just love that aspect of it. I also find for kind of, smaller tasks where it's, some of the marketing stuff that our program has to do, or, just routine things that it can save time that I don't feel like I really want to spend a lot of time on, or it's not as important to spend as much time on. But the downside of it is we just talked about this. I broke my phone yesterday. So I just got I was like on a 2018 iPhone 11, and I just upgraded to the new version, which bakes into it Apple Intelligence. And I'm not
Mm.
promoting Apple Intelligence in any way, but I noticed it's taken over everything. Now, when I text someone, it's like, okay, do you basically want to stick the AI Grammarly to it and write it more professional, and or make it more casual, and I just keep thinking, at what point are our children, because we both have young children,
Mm.
will our children grow up never knowing even how to write anything because AI is talking for them? And that's the kind of stuff that really worries me versus the kind of stuff I really love about it.
Yeah, but I think you hit it on the nail, because the problem is that what you described initially is a very considerate and probably a helpful use of generative AI, because you are the expert. And if it comes back with a counter argument that just is useless, then you will just discard it, right? But you're not using it as your first point. You're not asking it to create the first draft for you, which I would worry about, because it can anchor you into ways of thinking. And you're also not using it to produce things you are not able to fully verify. And it might be that the way you work, it's easier for you to verify things somebody else has done than produce them yourself. So that's the case for many people. I am terrible at reviewing things. So it takes me longer to review some things somebody else has done than to produce it myself. That probably explains why I don't co-author, why my supervisees basically hate me. But it, it it's much easier for me to think in my head and then put it out there than to put it out there and then think about it. So I think it has to do with your ways of working. But I found it very interesting that the UK government did a trial in the last quarter of 2024 with Copilot. They have published the results, and the mostly people used it to write emails, reports, minutes of meetings, and PowerPoint presentations, right? That sort of use worries me, because what you're doing is you're giving it some prompts and say produce a content. Probably it's not content that in the civil service context the user is going to use, but they're just going to pass it on to someone else. And in that point, that's where you lose the traceability of where did things originate. Is this authentic? Is this accurate? Because it just goes to somebody else. And if it's presented as a PowerPoint I made, but I don't tell you this was made by an AI, you will not probably be very detailed in your scrutiny, especially if we have a previous relationship and you trust me, you think that my work is usually good. So I think there's the first element there on being open and transparent about how this is being used for everyone to know. But there's also the issue about verification. There will be loads of things that can never be verified. For example, minute meetings. If you have someone produce a minute that then gets never approved or read by anyone because it takes too long to read the minutes and you're not verifying it, that gets set. And 5 years later, when there's litigation or a complaint about it, whatever the minute says is all we have to go by because it's the only record. So those are the things that really worry me, especially when we talk about technologies that, this is a message that doesn't go out sufficiently often. They are aiming for 80% accuracy, right? This is not knowledge-based. This is not ground truth. They're just creating probabilistic chains of words and hoping that 80% of the time they're going to be okay. Which means you work with a system that by default bakes in 20% confabulations. It's not that it hallucinates some of the time. It's hallucinating all of the time. But 80% of the hallucinations make sense because they are within the middle of what people have written before in the internet or what's been discussed in the field. But the other 20% is completely off. And that's a 20% you need to look out for when you're revising, but you don't know which is that 20%. You know if it's the beginning, the end, the middle, or it's peppered through it. So I think that's why, very considerate use when you use it as a critical friend or when you use it to refine something you fully understand can create productivity savings for some people, depending on how we work, but it's not a source of research, for example. I really worry when my students tell me, it's like, I don't use Google anymore. I ask ChatGPT. It's like, that you should not be doing. And when you Google, forget about the generative AI at the top. Keep going to the links because 1 out of 5 results, if you use it frequently enough, is going to be wrong. And who could live with that margin of error? I mean, I can't, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I tell this story about how I was working on we're going to get to our latest research, and I was working on my monster article on AI integrity, and my research assistants were in exams, and so I was putting my own articles into ChatGPT to have them blue book it or to put the citation format to save myself some time so it looked intelligible. And one of my own articles came back saying it was written by Pandora Tillipman, which today makes me laugh because of
Nobody
clearly an
knows your
obsession.
middle name.
Yeah, yeah, right. Clearly, obsession with Avatar, the movie, by ChatGPT. But I hear you on that, and I actually think that's right. And before we kind of turn into our research on how this means for governments, let me just say, like, I agree with you about the expertise, and that's the one area that worries me because I use it way more aggressively, obviously, than who doesn't use it. But if I'm doing a PowerPoint, it's not me saying what should my PowerPoint be on X topic. It's me talking into something in stream of conscious, saying make sure it addresses this, having it organize my notes. I know what content I want to use, but it's helping me organize it. I love using it for developing graphics, although frankly, graphics are so hard because there's so many errors in the graphics. I like the way it organizes things in chart forms or visually. So it's the stuff I know, but it's stuff I'm verifying. And so I find there's a lot of great ways to do it that really improve and help make things user friendly, visually friendly, help with organizing and streamlining. But I know what's in there and I understand the difference. And when I'm not sure about something or it's something new, I'm running things through 852 models to make sure it's accurate. I'm making sure there's always a link so I can verify the accuracy. I the other day I was having it read something and I asked for like I wanted to see what it would say. Read this article. What would be 5 quotes related to the research topic from this article that I could use? All 5 were hallucinated. All of them.
Yeah.
All of them. And so they're almost too perfect for what you want. But I'm not trying to be down, and I don't want anybody to take away from this conversation that we're down on AI. I think there's some unique things that we're dealing with, but it's some genuine issues, especially for those of us teaching law. And right now, I've spent the past week researching how on earth am I going to give my students a take-home exam when AI can help them cheat so easily, but also could I find a way to make sure they're getting knowledge and maybe use AI? Is there, and I am all over the place trying to figure out how to do this without resorting to them handwriting an exam in a locked room under time pressure conditions, which makes me sad that this might be what we're getting back to because of AI. But I'm not, if anybody's got great suggestions, let us know.
Yeah, no, I'm open to those as well. I have similar challenges, but I think that that's the problem that, if you think that AI is a knowledge source and you allow it to replace your process of acquiring that knowledge, that's when you're doing yourself a very big disfavor. And that's how some students are using it, right? So they say, they just put the prompt of whatever question you give them, put the syllabus and say, just write something based on that. But I think we underestimate how difficult the point of developing expertise is. For anyone to be able to be an expert like you and be able to read a document and on a split second say, this is just wrong, this bullet point makes no sense. This takes years of thinking, of doing the grueling work of putting together all the other PowerPoints. So you might be at a stage of sort of knowledge and expertise where you can use it effectively. But the point is, how is the next Jessica Tillipman be trained if she's starting law school now? And that worries me. And then it links to the issue of procurement, because the other problem we have in procurement is that most of the things that we are asking in the procurement context, if we use generative AI, are a one-off occurrence, right? So we will look at that one bit under those specific tender conditions once. And that's when generative AI is not particularly good. If it has seen something really, really similar to each other many, many times, and that's in the data, that probably is in the 80% where you can have more confidence it's not doing it. But each thing is going to be different dates, different locations, different products. So we're also not thinking about what's the best thing to do or where the big saving is going to be, because it's all high stakes, right? The other thing with generative AI, lots of people say it helps me be more creative. For example, I heard about someone that has a child that wants a story that has to include a whale every night, and every night wants a different story. At some point, you run out of stories, so you can ask ChatGPT, give me 500 words of something that happens with a whale and a couple of prompts. And that's great. It's very low stakes, and it probably fills in a gap in your skills that you don't want to develop, right? You don't want to become a creative writer just for the 6 months your child is going to want whale stories. But that's not how it's going to work in the professional setting. And particularly, it's not how it's going to work in the public sector, where factuality is very important, where usually the hard cases are the ones that require looking into it in detail, and where fundamentally, verifying is going to take you longer, because you have to redo the process if you want to fully verify things. So this is not to say Gen AI is horrible. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not good for things that require nuance, that require verification, and that have potentially high impacts on people's life, right? Don't use it to run admissions. Don't use it to run triaging for things. That's where things get complicated.
Yeah, it's I'll have to remind you after this. I'm working on a series of children's books where I've given ChatGPT my articles on corruption, and my first fully one with illustrations that I read to my daughters, my 6-year-old daughter's first grade class, to teach them about kind of ethics, because studies have shown the earlier you introduce them to ethics, it's better for when they join the workforce. It's called The Trouble with Tommy's Two Hats, and it's about a frog that has a conflict of interest, and it's hilarious. But and then eventually I'll get to Carla joins a cartel about collusion. So at some point I'll show you all my little books I'm working on. But getting, I had some ethics students that are do ethics guidance for the government that took my class last year that thought they were amazing. So I've got to come up with a series. But I want to get to that, because let's talk about how the government's using it. And, we're coming from both sides of the Atlantic right now. And, in the United States, we've seen a ping pong regulatory approach to the use of AI. And I'd say under the Biden administration, a far more cautious approach, a greater appreciation of the risks associated with AI, more interest in trying to address proactively the bias, the hallucination, and all the issues we already know. And just a week or so ago, we received the Trump administration's AI action plan, which is, by any objective assessment, very much fast, use it for everything, use it fast, get it up to speed. Regulation becomes secondary. In fact, there's an almost anti-regulation posture to it, so much so that it's actually considering threatening federal funding to the states and local entities that receive federal funding if they try to overregulate or even attempt to regulate AI. So it's really, really been a dramatic shift in terms of AI governance and AI regulation. And so that's coming at a time when we're seeing, at least in the United States, a dramatic uptick in the use of generative AI in all various aspects. In fact, I think there was an article about a week ago about how the government is using AI to identify and sift through 100,000 of regulations to figure out which ones to cut, which, given the hallucination issues we've just talked about, is terrifying unless you have some experts reviewing that work. And so you have the current administration and agencies aggressively using it while at a time that we're rolling back governance and regulation. And so you've talked a lot about this in your own work. And so I'm just curious your take on kind of this development in the United States versus how things are kind of developing in the EU and the UK.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I think the EU and the UK started maybe 4 years ago trying to go more down the regulatory path and say, okay, we realize, AI creates specific risks, and particularly when the public sector is going to use it, we want to put some guardrails in place. But then very quickly in the EU, the only piece of regulation that was put in place was this EU AI Act, and it's a tiered system of risks. But for example, just so you see how powerful the lobbying is when we try to regulate, it was very clear that almost any use by the public sector would be caught as high risk and therefore subjected to all of these requirements. And in the 11th hour, an exception was put there that you can exempt uses, for example, if they are for narrow procedural tasks or if they improve decisions already made. And those two really cracked my head because I never studied in law school the difference between a narrow and a wide procedural task, so I still don't know what that means. And I also don't understand from a logical perspective, how can you improve a decision that has been made, right? Either you reverse it or you change it, which is a new decision, or the decision stands. So we have lots of challenges in implementing those rules, but at least there was an attempt. The UK, because of Brexit and everything else, wanted to find another way, and I think it's like the Goldilocks they're trying to reach. So they say the EU regulates too much, the US doesn't regulate enough. We're going to do something in the middle. But this something in the middle is just lots of contradiction. So, for example, they have now closed deals with Microsoft for Copilot. They have a deal with OpenAI for ChatGPT. So they are very bullish in trying to get this big tech embedded into government and try to get them to identify use cases, which again is the wrong way around. But at the same time, they want to create a panel to overlook and look at these processes and try to identify responsible public sector AI use. So it's not trying to do something in the middle, it's trying to do both things at the same time, which I'm not sure you can do. What I think was good in the Biden administration's approach to AI was that it was not actually preventing it. There was no ban on it. It just said, we need to do this incrementally. We need to understand what these things mean, and we need to understand what is having a big impact, what is having a small impact, and like almost anything in life, start small, learn, and then scale it, right? And there were very good ideas, particularly in procurement, around very clear chains of command. There were these CIOs that would be responsible for things. So there were single points of accountability, which I thought was very good. And those points of accountability were in the public sector, which meant you putting your signature in a document, you have a whole host of other regulation that applies to your decisions, right? Whereas what we see now with all of this move fast, adopt it, we will see what happens, is that we move in the legal vacuum, right? So when you're simply telling every public sector worker, just use something off the shelf that you can get on the internet and use it in your work, then that is completely unregulated.
Right.
And it's going to be very, very, very difficult to apply the standard rules that we have for how decisions are made to that sort of use, because it almost never will be visible to us. So that's one worry. The other worry from a procurement perspective is that lots of these things will never be procured, because they are either offered for free or they are embedded into the other solutions that you already have. So it just, the way that this AI emerges into your software is simply by an update. And I'm not sure anybody has a contract for any software that is so detailed as to say you can actually stop an update from happening or you can require it to be reversed just because AI has been included, right? As long as it's not mission critical, something like that. I don't think anybody had the foresight to put in the contract. So it just being introduced and it's there and it's floating and we don't have rules. And that's what worries me because we can have lots of issues with how the rules are crafted and then we can discuss are they right or wrong, how we're going to implement them and difficulties with that. But when you're working with no rules, that's when I think trust in the public sector is at stake. Right? We have seen it in jurisdictions like Australia, where they had the Robodebt scandal, and that was not even very advanced AI. We've seen in the Netherlands with their Siri for flagging fraud in benefits, and this created basically it made a government collapse. And I think in the UK and I fear in the US, we are one step away of a scandal, or maybe the scandal is already brewing, but it hasn't emerged. And this is because we are not taking things slow. And what I think people that are really bullish about the digitalization of the public sector and the transformation is that they forget it's public sector. It needs to carry people's trust. Otherwise, people will stop paying their taxes. People will stop using public services. You know, not to be dramatic, but it's something that is really hard to reverse afterwards. So I don't think on any risk-benefit calculation, all of those more intangibles of trust of people and rule of law and so on are ever figuring. All I see now are productivity gains. This thing can save you 20 minutes per week of every civil servant. Therefore, in a year, this means you can chop so many works. And that doesn't work. The other use case that really worries me is this one about identifying things that we can take out of the rule book. Because one of the things I was always told in law school is the very good rules are rules that are never enforced because people just comply with them because it's a logical rule, it's a good default. You will never have litigation about them because they are accepted. And that would be the sort of thing that Gen AI maybe they will say, okay, find me rules that there's been no cases about. Let's chop them out. That's completely counterproductive, right? So it's very hard to know the logic behind those things or even how those prompts are given. There's no transparency about it. And the other thing, and I'm sure you'll get to it, is the organizational issues that can be behind that. We treat these models as if they're completely neutral and they can just do tasks in a way that anybody would accept and agree with. But that's just not the case. It depends on how they've been programmed, what they've been trained on, what prompts have been injected.
Yes.
So then you're not actually asking ChatGPT to do something. You're asking Sam Altman and whoever two or three people know how they did things to do that for you. But you're not saying it. So I have lots of concerns around that.
You've raised so many things, and I have so many different thoughts, and I can't even decide where to start with that. The one thing I will say, I want to put a pin in the idea of getting things commercial or commercial off the shelf because that is actually a big move by the Trump administration, and I want to talk about how if we're losing the ability to kind of quote unquote regulate because America is currently going through a very strong deregulation period. Is there the idea of regulation by contract, which I know you're very critical of in your writing, but is that the only hope? But increasingly, that is not necessarily an option unless we're really dealing with something kind of unique or custom. There's a big push towards kind of commercial solutions and commercial products to not reinvent the wheel so you can do it faster. And at that point, we're losing the ability to even regulate by contract and provide some of these protections or safeguards that I think many of us would like to see integrated into the contract. Let me come back to because I really want to have that discussion. But I hear you on the risk because the challenge that we have in procurement is that it's being purchased by a workforce, an acquisition workforce globally, not just the United States, but globally, who are not trained, who do not have the capacity, who do not understand necessarily. This isn't a knock on them. This is just they're not there yet in terms of capacity to understand what it is they're buying. And it's not just like going out and buying, going and getting like Microsoft Word or buying something very like straightforward in terms of IT, it can drift, it can hallucinate, it can be biased, it has increased risks of data poisoning and manipulation. We could go down the laundry list of why AI is a very different buy than normal tech and why you have to think of these things in advance when you're buying it. The one thing I will mention, and I'm going to talk about it here because I talk about it in my presentations when I train, is that we have to also find a way to more effectively communicate with the acquisition workforce about what this tech is. And the challenge I see is that there's the kind of really tech heavy nomenclature and descriptions, and then there's kind of stuff that doesn't really tell you. So when I train, I tell everybody to imagine, if it's an acquisition professional or if it's a lawyer or a law professor, to imagine the AI tech stack as a wedding cake. And I talk about the cloud infrastructure and data at the bottom. And then I talk about that. You have the foundation model. And above that, you have the application, tapping into the foundation model through API. And then on the top, you hopefully have a human in the loop. And it's not a pure AI tech stack, because anybody who's doing this for a living is like, you kind of forgot a few parts, right? I get that. But for most people, that's enough to get them to appreciate at this point, oh, the cloud infrastructure partnerships with the foundation model providers, that creates a potential lock-in risk, which we know is growing across governments around the world. And that also provides constraints in how the application vendors, where they can go, because they might have to use a certain foundation model that is already got a partnership with a specific cloud service provider. And when you've only got really 3 cloud service providers, that really increasingly narrows kind of the scope of how it's being done. The other big piece of it too is that most governments aren't making their own foundation models. They're mostly just licensing applications, and that's also changing the nature, because it's going to be commercial, about the level of ability to regulate the foundation model, or even that interrelationship between the infrastructure, the data protection, the foundation model, and then ultimately all the way up to the end user. And so when I walk people through potential organizational conflicts of interest, you have to start all the way back at infrastructure and data, and then you were talking all the way downstream at a potential, contractor who's competing for something. Maybe they were the same vendor that provided the cloud, infrastructure. Maybe they were the same vendor of the foundation model. But if you don't understand that chain, if you don't know the wedding cake, you do not understand your pure risks. And I think that is just, there's such a big challenge ahead of us, and I worry about how people are diving in headfirst without a true understanding of those risks.
Yeah, I think I don't know how it's organized in the US, but at least in the EU and in the UK, what happened is that when all those layers started emerging, then they became the subject of specialism, right? So cloud is mainly about data protection in the UK and in the EU, because we don't want the data to migrate to the US and other places. So there's people that understand only the bottom layer. And then user interfaces, that's a completely different user experience team that know that. And so on the one hand, that makes sense, because you cannot know about everything. But on the other hand, you only appreciate the cake if you see the whole cake. And that's a bit of a tricky balance. The other thing, and maybe this tells about you and me as bakers rather than teachers, but I imagine it's sometimes more like bread, right? So the problem is, in bread, you put in different ingredients, not many, right? It's flour, it's water, it's a little bit of yeast and a bit of salt. Some people put oil in it. Once the bread is baked, you cannot separate them. You cannot see the layers, because it's a single thing, and then you use it as a single thing. And with AI, I think that's the difficulty. For the user, it's a thing. It's not even about understanding the layers. You cannot see them, you cannot experience them, and that makes things difficult to grasp. The other thing that makes AI a little bit different from other tech, because some people said, well, what's the difference between an AI and a very complicated drone before AI, right? So people that buy drones, they don't understand all the engineering of the drones necessarily. I think with AI, what you buy is a socio-technical change in your organization. Because you don't buy an AI to do a siloed thing. You buy the AI to integrate it in your processes. And almost by definition, particularly with generative AI, throughout any of your processes. So when, I can imagine an acquisition professional that is told, go and buy yourselves a large language model that needs to do both powering our chatbot with the citizen, but also do back stuff, and it needs to write minutes. And how do you understand that? Because it's going to be used for everything. And I think that's the other element of complication, that it's what you need to think about is discrete use cases. Even within one organization, there will be use cases where it makes a lot of sense to use a large language model. There will be other use cases where it doesn't make sense. And how do you filter that down to your contractual requirements and issues is difficult because some of it, and that's why I'm a little bit critical of the regulation by contract, is that usually when you think about regulation by contract, you think about what am I going to make my vendor do, right? So as the acquisitions organization, I am the master of the contract. Why do I make you provider do so I pay you? But now, because it's all use cases, we need to regulate what the agency is going to be doing with the AI we're buying. And that's when the acquisitions people go like, beyond my pay grade. It's not me. I don't organize that. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical of it. First, it's difficult to do, and we can get to that later. But second, even if you got regulation by contract right, the moment the acquisition is finished, it passes to somebody else that can deviate from that contract. They can start using it improperly in the agency. They may not enforce clauses for whatever reasons. You can start having modifications and so on. So it's a little bit tricky. I mean, of course, if you can have regulation by contract and you can have nothing else, by all means have it. But this is like, if you can have a bread for your wedding, you're not going to be super happy. You would rather have had cake, right? So just to mix all of our metaphors.
Although, like coming from Europe, I'm sure that the bread that you guys are baking is much better than ours in the United States. Although we've gotten better, there are places that are much better
I hear
now.
so, yeah.
I will say I went to when I was most recently in Paris, I had bread and I was expecting to be blown away like I was back in the day. And I was like, we have some places that are pretty good these days. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge with all of this. And it's funny that you're mentioning the kind of the use once the contract has been awarded and now you're like deploying the AI. And I spend a lot of time. I recently just did a training series for the Defense Acquisition University, and for our non DoD, non US listeners, that's the Department of Defense. It's really a training arm of DoD, and I was trying to explain that the hard work, to quote my colleague Steve Schooner, the hard work begins after contract award. It's kind of like a marriage, right? You think it's hard when you're planning your wedding, and then you can relax, but it's actually all the hard work is in the performance. And so I was talking them through, like, what are the types of things you would put into a contract that would be different, the type of intellectual property and data rights, kind of pre-pricing or pre-negotiating terms that deal with things like retraining because of drift and bias, reporting requirements and other cybersecurity protocols, because we know in government procurement law that bad stuff happens, which is why many procurement laws have disputes clauses and modification clauses that you plan for in advance, because it's not always going to go perfect. But I hear you. If you're using a commercial solution, you're using some commercial AI application, and you haven't negotiated any of those types of terms, and it gets used for different purposes than you anticipated, and you lose control over that, especially when you're dealing with things like the use of government data to train models and potentially benefiting a company, whether it's the application or the foundation model, benefiting it in its commercial work, benefiting it in a future government procurement. There's so many risks associated with doing it. And it's not me saying commercial is always bad, but what's challenging in this is that if we're moving away from the ability to kind of tailor some of these clauses, and I know you have doubts about the effectiveness of regulation of contract, but if I'm looking at a scenario where I'm not going to get any new AI regulation, what can I do to prepare the acquisition workforce to negotiate clauses that still adequately protect the government? There may be more room in some of the non-traditional pathways. The U.S. government's increasingly pushing other transaction authority, which is outside the FAR, right? You're supposed to kind of move away from the standard FAR clauses or the federal acquisition regulation clauses, and in using these kind of non-traditional pathways, maybe that gives you that flexibility to integrate some of these terms. But again, I bring you back to, I'm watching an administration that's consolidating procurement, a lot of procurement into one agency. It's pushing commercial solutions, and I feel like that window is closing, and decreasing the ability, at least in the United States, to get some of those, what I just consider smart buying, right? Smart ways to protect the government. I don't think these are things that would be controversial to any person if you sat down and you said, like, I'm worried about bias, I'm worried about hallucination, I'm worried about, drift, and in governments using this in their services and their operations, because I want to make sure that when we are providing a government service that this is accurate, that it's validated and verified. And if you tell them, like, look, if we're going with the contractors, standard terms and conditions for a lot of this, and we're not able to bake some of these things into the contract, that reduces the ability to do these things. I think most people would look at that and say, that's not great. That's not a
Mm.
good thing. And unfortunately, I think we're at a turning point in the United States where, and again, I have friends that work in tech industry, many friends. I am not anti-tech industry. What worries me is that some of the loudest voices against any form of regulation are the ones being heard and not the ones that would even be open to modest regulation. That I always say I'm a regulation swing state, right? I'm like
Mm.
right there. I am the Goldilocks approach with regulation. I think too much stifles innovation, makes it harder to work with the government. I think too little leads to the Wild West. But I feel like we're very much in Wild West territory right now, where you heard the president of the United States saying, like, we can't worry about copyright. Like, that'll slow down the AI. Well, copyright's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
So I'm worried right now that that window is closing and that it's going to take a big scandal in the United States to finally get the kind of governance change that we should have been doing from the outset.
Yeah. It's very interesting because the flip side of this approach to trying to negotiate by contract, try to do other transaction authority, is that you can only negotiate with those that can actually change things. And going back to the issue that this has so many layers, that means in the end, the only way you're going to have a tailor-made solution to you at the interface stage is if you can change things in the cloud layer, and you can change things in the large language model layer, and you can change things in the data processing layer. And what that means that that has to be done under the same stack. You cannot really have someone coming as an integrator or as a developer at the top end and actually change things because they will say, well, I use Google's cloud. So it's the Google T's and C's. I cannot negotiate them. So I think that the downside to this, and I think also because of the history of antitrust in the US, it's not hard to see that once you start doing that, you're going to have a very narrow oligopoly of three or four, and by nature, because it's going to have such a strong lock-in effect, it's just going to be very hard to reverse, but also it's just going to basically split the administration. So if the federal government has done lots of whatever, provider A, I'm sure the states will have been under lots of pressure to go provider B because it's existential. And so you'll have a split, but those will become their natural markets and will become almost monopolistic. And we see it with the litigation that has nothing to do with the government, but we for years we've been discussing should Google be broken up because search and everything else really shouldn't be going together. I don't really see a scenario where in a reasonable timeline a federal judge or the US Supreme Court is going to decide, AT&T needs to be broken up. It's not going to happen in the AI scene because it's not the wind that's blowing. So I think that's the other difficulty we have, that the more we try to rely on non-regulatory solutions, the more we're basically saying, well, we only have four people on the other side of the table. The advantage that is not recognized in regulation is that it creates a standard. And then the standard means, if you have to process data in this way, the guy that wants to integrate can or should be able to enforce that standard of the cloud provider, because the cloud provider is also obliged to comply with the standard. So it creates a modularity in the digital supply chain that can create competition in different bits. Not everybody's going to train a large language model, but the large language model will have to comply with whatever the government wants because all of the interfaces are going to be demanding it. And so there's lots of moving parts. And I think that the other issue that going back to the point of when does regulation stifle innovation is that what you hear in the UK context, because the UK is less regulated than the EU, is that most companies say, well, with the EU we have certainty. We know what they are asking for. We may not like it, we may try to change it, but it allows us to plan. And it allows us to make decisions on how much do we invest in what. When you don't have regulation, what you have is uncertainty. And you will have seen it with, the US trade policy. Uncertainty basically breeds inflation, breeds lower investment, breeds all those sorts of things. So not having regulation for AI, I'm not sure is necessarily an ideal space to be in, even if you are very much pro-growth or pro-innovation, because people will not be sort of making investments for the longer term. the other further complication here is that you say use commercial solutions. Okay, how are they going to work with what you already have in-house? Probably they will only work if the interoperability is already baked in. Again, this is something I hear in the UK. We just did recently a project on local government procurement of AI with Rachel Caldicott, who's a colleague that does a technology foresight work. And what we kept hearing from people in local administration is we don't even go to market. We are either a Microsoft house or we are a Google house, and we just get whatever is already interoperable because we're not going to take the risk of buying something that then is going to create interoperability issues, and we are left holding the candle. So I think that's the other issue. Lock-in is already a big issue. That's where the window is also narrowing. And what we need there is regulatory solutions. For example, in the UK, again, the Competition Markets Authority, so more or less the equivalent of your FTC, has done an investigation on cloud. And one of the things that is very heavily disputed is whether you should have egress fees at all or not.
Right.
Right? Some people say you need to get rid of the egress fees so people can change. Some people say if you get rid of the egress fees, what you do is you create underinvestment while you're in the contract because nobody's going to give you very high quality if you can change the next day. It's not very clear. And what I don't think we live in right now is a context where evidence will be gathered. We will do some serious economic studies, and then we will see whether egress fees are on the whole better or worse. We will just be in a position where either we will oppose egress fees on whatever ideological grounds we have, or on whatever business interest we have, or we will want to entrench them again on whatever interest we have. And that's where the discussion I think is going, because we are very much in the no regulation or full regulation discussion. We are not necessarily going through the nuances that are required of all of these things and thinking again, maybe different cases are different. Maybe, it makes sense to pay egress fees if you are in the consumer case. I don't know, for example, you just bought a new phone. If they gave it to you with a finance, probably they want you to stay in the contract for as long as you have to pay the phone. That makes sense. It makes it easier for you to access the phone. But if you're the government, you don't need that sort of thing, right? You're going to be here tomorrow. So maybe you don't need to have egress fees or minimum duration of contracts or things like that. And again, I don't think we are discussing things very helpfully because we talk about government use of generative AI as if you or I would use it. Whereas I think it would be much more interesting to see about how do very big, very complicated organizations in the private sector use AI and what are they allowing their people to do or not. And if you go by the press, lots of companies that were quite bullish in moving to AI, now they're moving away from AI, hiring people again because they realized it didn't quite work. So, experimentation is good, but maybe, at a slower pace and thinking the implications a bit more fully.
I feel like you've put your finger on one of the issues about they're more bullish. There's this sense both in terms of what the communications I'm reading from the administration and from even companies where there's this I have to have more AI, like AI for the sake of AI. Because people are using it, I need to use AI rather than the correct way, which is I have this problem or I have this thing that takes way too long that could be automated or it's really hard to detect collusive patterns in bidding scheme, among contractors. Let's use technology to help us identify anomalies or to identify suspicious, bidding schemes over a period of time. Those are all really good things that you can do. And you've identified a problem. This takes me too long to do X. AI could actually help me do this and, in a reasonably low risk manner. Right. And so I always do when I do my presentations, I have a slide with a baby looking at a shiny ball, the shiny object, and I say we do not use AI to use AI. We have a problem, and then we try to see if there is an AI solution for it. And so I think that that's part of it, and I hear that way too often. The other thing is, we've learned from this when we talk about industries in which there's dramatic consolidation. We've seen that play out, particularly in the public procurement space. I mean, we only need to look at the defense industry and all the challenges that has created over the years, whether it's organizational conflicts of interest, which is a big one, and frankly, a massive one in AI that I don't think people fully grasp because they don't understand the wedding cake or the bread, however you want to describe it. I think that it creates issues. It creates single points of failure when we're talking about one thing goes bad and the whole thing comes down. Over reliance. The other thing I think, which is short sighted about the kind of true anti-regulation posture is that, yeah, maybe today the lack of regulation regarding lock-in or interoperability or even the egress fees, whatever that is, maybe today that benefits you because you're the winner. But what about tomorrow? What about the day you get locked out and then you can no longer compete? So I feel like there's a short-sighted aspect to that, that the reason we want competition, the reason we have these regulations in the first place is because truly we want the whole system to be perceived and to be fair, right? But we also know that ultimately it provides the government with better goods, services, prices, value, etc. And so I think ultimately it's lose-lose to not take advantage of these things. I will say in favor of the government, you have some really smart people thinking of these things that I think might be, and again, I'm not putting this on a single person, might be frustrated with some of this kind of speed at the expense of regulation posture. But, I think we saw DoD just recently award a major contract to 4 different providers, right? And to me, that's a move towards having a choice or multi-cloud approaches to things. So I think there's some genuine strategic thinking happening because people recognize it. But I worry again when it comes at the expense of like somebody pounding on the table now, faster, and I don't know where that leaves us. And so maybe we turn a little bit to now that we're all gloom and doom. I want to turn to one piece that's related to everything we've talked about, so that people aren't listening to us too, because we could talk for 4 hours about this right now, and would do it. I have the coffee in my GW camphor mug. The thing I'll turn to is the workforce, and you recently published. It was a presentation? Was it a
It's a draft
article or was it
paper. Yeah.
a draft paper? And I also just published something with my colleague Steve Schooner, and it was focused on the acquisition workforce. And when we specifically look at them in the kind of AI context, wow, multiple government accountability reports have come out, and I'm not sure if you have those versions in the corollaries in the EU, but have pointed to dramatic capacity deficiencies among the whole federal workforce, not just acquisition workforce, but whole federal workforce when it comes to the acquisition of technology, but also, just generally the neglect and underinvestment in capacity of our acquisition workforce has been staggering. And we've seen this in the piece that I did with Steve, really walks us through just decades of neglecting the acquisition workforce. In the 90s, the DoD workforce was cut by half, again, under the guise of efficiency, and it was not done strategically. And then the US government spent the next decades trying to build back up the acquisition workforce pipeline and build back up the capacity, only to once again, as of January of 2025, to completely gut the workforce again, again, not strategically. I think somebody just came out with a report last week. I think it was a Senate investigation into the billions of dollars in waste right now associated with the deferred retirement program, where people basically the fork in the road, where people are just being paid to sit at home right now and not work. The incentivized retirements in a workforce that's already graying and too junior and doesn't have the institutional knowledge or experience. And then the dramatic push to completely overhaul the rules at a time when you're dealing with a workforce that's struggling. And so it kind of just creates this mess on top of a period of change, right? AI procurements, emerging tech procurements, changing rules. And I want to get your take on it from what you're witnessing from outside the United States, but also kind of what's happening in Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think sadly the story sounds all too familiar. So the exact same timelines and the exact same problems can be traced, particularly in the UK. So we have the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons issuing reports that mirror those and saying, at some point in I think it was 2008 or 2009, they said public procurement is the Cinderella of the public sector, right? It's like what the least investment goes into. And this has been a problem. And what I think the difficulty with the workforce is that, you can write whatever you want in the statute book. And you can take whatever you want out of the statute book. That's not going to make any change. It's when people understand that and implement it that it's going to happen. And same thing with procurement. Here in the EU, for example, there is this constant frustration. We have less and less competition. We don't use it strategically, so we're not greening it quickly enough. We're not making it digital quickly enough. And so we must change the rules. No, things are not moving because we don't have the people with the skill sets to do things that are complicated, that require risk taking. And particularly if you're a workforce under pressure, if you're spread very thin, you will not have the time to consider complicated decisions and to do things other than how you always did it, just because that's where your comfort zone is. So I think it's all the same everywhere. When it comes to the specific issue of AI, it's not realistic, I think, to create unique or elite units to buy AI and say, oh, what we're going to do is we're going to have one small group of people that understand this. They're going to buy it for the whole government, which is what the UK is trying to do now, right? So they're trying to apply a motto that is buy once, use many times. Maybe that's going to sort out the specific issue of capacity in terms of AI, but it creates a big problem in terms of adoption. Right? People that are going to be told this is the AI you use, they will not understand anything. They will not have access to the contracts. So what I see is that we move the problem around, and this is because the simple realization, I think it comes strongly in your piece with Steve or the piece I wrote with Nathan Davis from Oxford, is that this is expensive infrastructure that we need, and it is expensive. And it's very much like infrastructure, as we say, for two reasons. First, you only realize about that when it breaks. Procurement doesn't make the news when it awards super nice contracts that work perfectly well. Procurement makes the news when there's either a scandal of corruption, which is a bit more in your field, or when something is done very, very badly, which is a bit more in my field. And you don't want that. What you would want is for nobody to ever talk about procurement just because it works, but that is expensive, right? And the same way, you don't want anyone to be talking about bridges that fall. You should never hear about it, but that requires investing in it, fixing it before. And that's the difficulty. And AI, I think, is just simply a mirror, right? When now we consider about how difficult and practically, I don't know, problematic it is to buy AI, it's because AI is just putting a mirror in front of us and say, you don't have the expertise. In commercial terms, you have the expertise in digital terms, and you have basically hollowed out a whole function of government that because it was very low ranking in terms of priorities and so on, nobody was actually paying attention to. But look at the problem you have now. Because now, if you don't buy the AI rightly, this affects the whole of government, which is different from if you don't buy, I don't know, schools tables rightly, which is only education is affected, right? And that's one problem. And the other problem is, like infrastructure, it takes a very long time to build up. It's very easy for it to collapse, but then rebuilding it is going to take a very long time, and it's going to be very, very difficult. And it will require a lot of upfront investment. I don't know. I think if you created a free funded program for people to get trained to become procurement officials, people would take it up. If there's a job at the end of the line, people will take it up. But this requires not expecting people to take massive gambles, take massive financial costs to trying to get into a profession that nobody ever heard about. As we started, people stumble onto procurement. Now, I speak to lots of 6-year-olds now. Nobody goes like, I want to be a procurement official when I'm older, right? It's like, there's no superhero comic of a procurement official.
My kids do. I don't know about yours, but my
well,
kids
not mine. That probably tells something about their parenting as well. But it's not very visible. But I think it's going to take some time. And the other thing is, who wants to step into a profession that is facing those challenges? Right? So who wants to go and think, oh, I'm going to spend the next 30 years trying to figure this out and trying to mop up all of the problems of the last 30 years? It's not particularly appealing, right? So, yeah.
Sorry, I realized I almost cut you off. I've got to learn my podcast hosting etiquette.
It's episode 1, so it's all on.
It's a learning curve, right? It's funny you say that. It's the challenge with all of this is right now you're right, it's expensive, right? It's expensive and it's hard to rebuild all of these things. And part of it's got to be a multi-pronged approach. I'm going to give a big shout out to my predecessor at GW, Karen Thornton, who's been working with a program called DCTC. And it's this program out of DoD where it's designed to partner with undergraduate institutions to really create a pipeline, a sustainable pipeline of people when they're junior, when they're young, when they're in college and they're thinking about their careers, get them involved early to build out that strategic pipeline into the acquisition workforce, which is really brilliant because I can't speak to your experience in university, but I know when it comes to government contracts and law schools, I get a lot of first year law students that come that have never heard of government contracts. Every year, our first event is like the second week of school, and it's like, what is a government procurement, right? Because most of them know business and finance, and they know environmental, and they know labor and employment, they know litigation, but they don't know of our field, and we really have to show them. So but what we found is that the earlier you expose people to procurement, they see how fascinating it is and how it's really, there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of business judgment that goes into it, that it impacts everybody's lives, whether you're doing international development or you're just buying, tables for a school, right? Or you're buying drones. Whatever it is, I think it's an exciting field and you really have to build that pipeline. But I also think when it comes to the training, the challenge you have, it's not even just putting aside money to do that, which is not happening in the United States. They're cutting off in-person trainings. They're cutting off the ability to interact with people on these issues. I think that it's not about going to training or watching a webinar and then saying like, here's the checklist. I think it goes deeper. And one of the reasons my predecessor was such a big proponent of creating and expanding our law degrees for non-attorney acquisition professionals, which we do through our MSL program, is because she said, well, we need to teach the contracting officers to also think like lawyers, like to understand the law, to understand the analysis, to think strategically, and also to learn to write. Because what we have found is that, and again, this isn't just about plugging my program, even though it is quite good. There's my car sales pitch. The thing I will say about it is we watch our students graduate with this new skill set. And I have students just recently, I was at a conference and one came up to me and said, I wrote a memo justifying something, and our outside counsel, she's in-house acquisition professional. She said they big lawyers looked at it and said this was outstanding. And it's because we taught them how to write, and we taught them how to think, and we taught them how to exercise that strategic business judgment that I think most people agree we want our workforce to have. But if we just send them to a low level training where they check the box, and we don't invest in these kind of more comprehensive advanced programs, which cost a lot of money and take a lot of time, then we're no better than we were with you just kind of saying, everybody go use your purchase card and go online and shop at amazon.gov, right? And so I think that is one of the biggest challenges we have. And I don't think there's one solution, but I applaud my colleague. We'll probably have Karen on soon to talk about that, because I think it's a model that governments around the world should be looking to, that it should be expanded not only in the United States, but globally. But man, what a time. What a time. Yeah. It's challenging, especially with the rhetoric out there. When I heard the rhetoric of what people were referring to federal employees in early January and February as like parasites, and it was heartbreaking to see. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where you see anybody wanting to join government when that's the attitude taken towards them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the only further thing is then, just for people that are in those programs that have the privilege of accessing that opportunity, that's why using generative AI is so bad. Because you don't get through the process of developing that nuanced strategic thinking. You will not be able to do that additional, deeper understanding if you just rely on something to think for you. And again, this is something we have, exchanged recently, but there are all these studies coming out saying if the first thing you do is use generative AI, actually your brain function reduces, right? And what we're trying to do is get people to make those connections, to get their brains geared into thinking in a specific way. And maybe that closes the loop today, right? So it's to say, all of these things are intermeshed. In the end, what we have is an issue of capacity. And that capacity can be a problem whether you try to regulate or whether you try to contract for outcomes or you try to do something else. We have a problem with capacity. And then we have the issue of the technology that we think is a solution actually being part of the problem or exacerbating the problem, right? It's so to say, you will not need experts on anything else because AI knows everything. No. You will need experts that are able to supervise the AI, which is like the super expert. And AI gets in the way of training those experts in that pipeline model, right? So we're trying to have people that can be in a podcast like this, in 20 years, talking about the challenges of the time. That's what we're thinking about. That's the horizon government needs to consider, not making a 3% saving on this year's budget at
Yeah.
best. Just taking whatever optimistic claims companies can peddle. So yeah, that's all part of the same conversation, I think.
Ugh, God, what a depressing note to end on. But
Sorry.
hope for
That
a future
usually
in
end
which
like
there
that.
will be more doing. I know, right? Okay, so I think we've gone for about an hour on this, and let me just say, like, I could probably continue this forever,
Yeah,
but
it's been
I'm
great.
mindful of people not wanting to listen for 4 hours on us riffing on AI and workforce and procurement. So I want to know. I was going to ask you something fun about like what are you reading right now or watching, but we all know that everyone's watching K-pop Demon Hunters on Netflix.
No comment.
Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Have you even heard of it?
No, I don't know what you're talking about.
How, Albert, I mean, I know you've been like in like the mountains on
Yeah.
vacation, but like okay, so it is all okay. So I will say this: I do try to reference pop culture when I do these big trainings because I think I had like 2,000 people when I did my AI integrity training, and I was talking about these things. It is so good. It is a kids cartoon. And you know what K-pop music is, right?
Yes, I know that.
Okay. So my kids first watched it, and then I was like, "What is this thing?" And then I watched it, and now literally 24/7 in my house, I think to the dismay of my husband, we are blasting the music. It is like the number one. It's I think it's kind of one of the biggest Netflix shows or movies that's ever been created. It was for kids. It's funny. There are definitely some plot gaps because
It's
it
for
is for
kids.
kids, but the characters are awesome. The music is amazing. It's like the top charts of music. Albert, you
That's what
got.
I'm going
Do
to
you
do
not?
this
Do
evening.
you have Netflix? Do you have
I,
Netflix?
I do I do have
Okay, I
Netflix,
almost
yes.
believed you did it. I will say this. I actually don't really watch TV or movies anymore. I used to. I read, almost exclusively read. But K-pop, Demon Hunters, I am all in on this. So everyone listening, watch it. But I will end on not K-pop Demon Hunters, although again, if you don't call me singing Soda Pop or Golden, I
You'll
will
be very
feel
disappointed.
I'll be very sad. I will say I did try to play it for the grandparents when they came, and they were like, "What is this nonsense?" But on it's so good. Okay,
Okay.
what is your latest research on? And I know it has nothing to do with what we talked about today.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with AI. Basically, I said my piece and I keep repeating myself being the depressing guy in the room. So I'm trying to change a little bit and depress people on other fronts. But in the UK, in January 2024, we had a new regime for procurement only for the healthcare sector. And then in February 2025, a new rulebook on procurement, the Procurement Act 2023. So I'm looking at how these things are being rolled out and trying to make sense of whether these deregulatory attempts actually generate anything good. Again, my hypothesis is a little bit like we were talking before we went live, is, there's this effort to deregulate, which means take things out of the FAR or the Procurement Act and put it in guidance, which means that the total volume of things that you need to know about to run a procurement grows. And I think that's what's happened in the UK, right? So they wanted to streamline the act, but now we have tons of guidance. There's even if somebody wants to write a PhD in the UK, there's a difference between statutory guidance and non-statutory guidance, and within the non-statutory guidance, the difference between the recognized non-statutory guidance and just things agencies say. So I'm trying to think about those things and see what this means in terms of procurement reform a bit more seriously. And I think, my intuition is that I will end up where we were 10 minutes ago, which is to say, whatever the rulebook says, that is not going to create a real world change. What it requires is capacity and, doing the grueling work of actually contracting things and managing them and so on.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually spent the weekend writing a list of all the things now that they are trying to overhaul the FAR in a quote revolutionary way. And I'm not making fun of the person who came up with that name, but it just makes me laugh a little. The the number of things that have to be consulted now on like a hypothetical average procurement because they're disaggregating everything is grown significantly. And I'm not quite convinced that's the way to go. If you look back to, and I feel like I've been citing to him all this whole time, but Steve Schooner's Desiderata, which is like a
Mm,
key
It's like the
reading for
K-pop
anyone.
of 2002.
Right. It is close, just not nearly as good as K-pop, Demon Hunters. Sorry, Steve. But one of the foundational principles is uniformity, right? Because the FAR used to be all over the place, and that's why we made the history of government contracting available. Thank you to the author Jim Nagel, who made it available to our library to give to people, because it was like, look where we were. And now look what's happening. And unfortunately, history does indeed tend to repeat itself. Anything else I forgot before we sign off on this hopefully fabulous first new podcast?
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be fabulous. I look forward to the reviews. But no,
This is the worst.
Next time, just put a bit more of your research in. Let the guest talk less. I think that's going to make it more successful.
Just have ChatGPT run the whole thing.
Don't do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, Albert, thank you for being my first guest, and thanks as always. It's been a joy, and I will have you back on the show soon to hear more about your latest research. So thanks again.
It's been my pleasure and privilege. I look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the FAR. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future conversations at the intersection of law, policy, and practice.